Robert Surcouf. His name is embroidered in gold on the pages of French history, but beneath that gilded surface lies a far dirtier truth. Born in Saint-Malo in 1773 to a family of shipowners, he preferred the salty wind and a ship's deck to scholarly pursuits from a young age. At 17, instead of patiently waiting for a place in the merchant fleet, he defied fate by stepping aboard a slave ship. This was his first immersion into a world where only the strongest survived, and where morality was merely an inconvenient hindrance. He was no romantic of the sea, obsessed with ideals of freedom. He was a predator. During the Revolutionary Wars, when France desperately needed money and resources, Surcouf did not hesitate. He challenged the English fleet not for glory, but for personal gain, and his privateering raids became legendary. Aboard his Adèle, and later the famous Confiance, he seized dozens of enemy ships laden with treasures, silk, spices, anything that could be sold. His tactics were simple: speed, surprise, and ruthlessness. He took no prisoners if it wasn't profitable, and showed no mercy to those who stood in the way of his wealth. Thus, from a daring adventurer whose hands were elbow-deep in other people's blood and gold, Robert Surcouf transformed into one of the wealthiest men in France. He bought himself a noble title, estates, and influence. He became what society came to call a respectable citizen, a national hero, an aristocrat. But let's face the truth, he was no noble knight of the sea. He was a ruthless pirate whose crimes the state simply rebranded as exploits when it became politically expedient. His aristocracy was not a legacy of honor, but a direct consequence of blatant plunder, legalized by war. And in that, there is not an ounce of romance, only cold calculation and cruelty. In the world where Robert Surcouf took his first steps, there was no room for sentiment. Saint-Malo, his hometown, didn't just look at the sea, it lived by it, breathed it, profited from it. This port was the cradle of corsairs and slave traders, a place where desperate courage was valued above virtue, and wealth, acquired by any means, automatically bestowed status upon its owner. Here, amidst the smell of salt fish and other suffering, young Robert's character was forged. His family, shipowners, was undoubtedly part of this ruthless system. They did not teach him high moral principles. They taught survival and capital accumulation in a world where human life was just another unit of merchandise. It was in this atmosphere, steeped in cynicism and a thirst for profit, that 17-year-old Surcouf stepped onto the deck of a slave ship. This was not just his first voyage. It was an immersion into the deepest and darkest abyss of human cruelty. Imagine months in a confined space where pain, fear, and despair were palpable, where the cries of the dying mingled with the sound of waves, and human bodies, shackled in the hold, turned into living cargo to be delivered with minimal losses. Surcouf didn't just observe, he was part of this machine. He saw how people lost their humanity, how wills were broken, how hope died. Every day on that ship was a lesson. Morality is just a word when money and power are at stake. This first experience became his point of no return. He didn't just survive. He adapted, accepted the rules of the game where weakness was punished and ruthlessness was rewarded. Was it trauma? Perhaps. But more likely, it was the final calibration of his inner compass, which from then on pointed to only one goal: personal enrichment, achieved by any means. It was there, amidst the groans of slaves and the smell of death, that Robert Surcouf definitively transformed from a boy into a predator, whose grip would only strengthen with years. He learned the main lesson. In this world, the victor is he who is not afraid to get his hands dirty and does not burden himself with unnecessary anxieties. And he applied this lesson to the end of his life, building his empire on the blood and gold he so ruthlessly took from others. When France plunged into the chaos of the Revolution and then the Napoleonic Wars, the ideals of liberty and equality quickly gave way to a harsh reality. The country was bleeding and desperately needed money. The treasury was empty, trade routes were cut by the British fleet, and the economy was on the verge of collapse. In this moment of desperation, when traditional methods of warfare and budget replenishment proved ineffective, the state turned to a proven, though highly questionable, instrument: privateering. This was not merely a measure, but an entire state policy, disguising plunder as patriotism. The government issued letters of marque, essentially licenses for legalized piracy. Any captain capable of equipping a vessel could obtain such a document, and then his raids against enemy ships laden with goods became not a crime, but a valiant act of service to the nation. France could not afford to maintain a powerful military fleet capable of rivaling the British, but it could stimulate thousands of private predators who, acting alone or in small groups, inflicted colossal damage on enemy trade. In this atmosphere, where the nation's survival depended on the ability to take from others, the lines between heroism and banditry blurred beyond recognition. Society, exhausted by wars and deprivations, did not question the moral purity of the sources of wealth. On the contrary, those who returned to port laden with spoils, gold, silver, spices, fabrics, instantly became national heroes. Their names were chanted in the streets, and their adventures became legends. The money brought in by privateers revitalized the economies of port cities, fed thousands of families, and supplied the army and navy. It was a cynical but highly effective mechanism for redistributing others' resources in favor of the state, and incidentally, into the pockets of those who were not afraid to shed blood. Such a climate became the perfect breeding ground for individuals without moral principles, but with a keen nose for profit and extraordinary courage. In a world where the state itself had turned piracy into a virtue and wealth acquired through violence became the highest measure of success, the path from adventurous boy to respectable citizen lay through dozens of captured ships and hundreds of lives broken for gold. This was an era when France, desperately clinging to life, not only turned a blind eye to the dirtiest methods, but actively encouraged them, creating legends out of its most ruthless sons. And Robert Surcouf, wasting no time, plunged into this bloody race. In 1795, without waiting for official permission, he armed the merchant ship Creole and set sail. This was an outright act of banditry, merely veiled by the smokescreen of war. He seized several British ships laden with valuable goods. When he returned, he was met not by prison, but by a cheering crowd. The authorities, desperately needing money, overlooked the legal formalities. Surcouf had proven, for him, the law was merely a recommendation, and profit the sole measure of success. A year later, on the Modeste, he continued his unauthorized raids, each time returning with spoils that solidified his position in Saint-Malo. Only after a series of such piratical successes, in 1797, did the government finally issue him an official letter of marque. It was a pragmatic calculation. Why fight someone who brings in such revenue? Better to legitimize his activities, putting them at the service of the state's coffers. But the true legend, or rather, Surcouf's most grandiose exploit, unfolded in 1800. Aboard the Confiance, a ship specially built for privateering, Robert Surcouf sailed into the Indian Ocean, targeting the rich trade routes from India to Europe. In the Bay of Bengal, he encountered the British East Indiaman Kent. This was no mere merchant vessel, but a powerful ship armed with 20 cannons and carrying over 400 people. Surcouf's chances, with his 26 cannons and 150 men, seemed negligible. But Surcouf never relied on numerical superiority. His tactics were honed: speed, surprise, and merciless boarding. He brought the Confiance alongside the Kent, allowing the British guns to fire only one volley before his crew swarmed the deck. The battle was short but incredibly brutal. The British captain Ripton was killed, his crew quickly broken. Blood spilled across the deck as Surcouf and his men ruthlessly dealt with those who resisted. The result of this battle was stunning. The Kent was captured, and its holds were crammed with untold riches: diamonds, spices, gold, silver, valuable fabrics. The value of the loot was estimated in millions of francs, an astronomical sum. Surcouf didn't just capture the ship, he robbed every passenger, every crew member, taking personal valuables, money, and jewels. It was a cold-blooded robbery, executed with military precision. The capture of the Kent became the apex of his privateering career, bringing Surcouf not only a fabulous fortune, but also global renown. He returned a hero, his hands elbow-deep in other people's gold and blood. To a nation exhausted by war, he was a savior, bringing wealth and hope. It was a triumph of cynicism. The more he plundered, the more ruthless he acted, the higher he rose in society's eyes. The capture of the Kent made him a legend, but Surcouf's true genius lay not only in ruthless boarding actions, but also in his masterful command of an invisible weapon, psychology. He wasn't just a desperate captain, he was a master manipulator, keenly attuned to the pulse of the era and human weaknesses. His charisma on board was absolute. He didn't just command, he infected his men with a lust for gain, transforming them into a single merciless mechanism. Surcouf understood that ordinary sailors fought for wages, but his crew fought for a share of untold riches, and this incentive was far more powerful than any order. He always kept his word regarding the division of spoils, and this predictability and generosity cemented the fanatical loyalty that allowed him to board ships vastly superior to his own in crew numbers. But his influence extended far beyond the deck. In Saint-Malo and later in Paris, Surcouf masterfully managed his public image. He didn't hire publicists. He was his own PR campaign. Every captured prize, every ship returning to port laden with trophies, became part of a carefully constructed narrative. He skillfully fueled excitement, turning his raids into thrilling stories that were passed by word of mouth. He knew how to use rumors and exaggerations to make his name synonymous with success and good fortune. This is how he attracted new investors, ready to pour vast sums into his next expeditions, and the most desperate daredevils, dreaming of sharing his glory and plunder. He became living proof that in chaotic France, one could not only survive but become fabulously wealthy if one wasn't afraid to break the rules and possessed enough courage. Surcouf also possessed an astonishing ability to choose the right people, his experts. These were not only experienced navigators or gunners, but also those who could help him navigate bureaucratic mazes, legalize his plunder, and even lobby his interests in government circles. He built a network of connections based on mutual benefit, where every participant was guaranteed a share in his criminal empire. He understood that even the most successful pirate needed protection and support, and he skillfully found it among those who were willing to overlook methods for results. His personal adaptability was phenomenal. He didn't just adjust to circumstances, he molded them to his will. From a powerless cabin boy on a slave ship to an unauthorized pirate, and then to an officially recognized privateer, each stage of his life was a step in a carefully planned evolution. He changed tactics, strategy, even his mannerisms, depending on whom he was dealing with. An English captain during a boarding, an official in port, or a potential investor in a salon. This capacity for metamorphosis, for instantly switching roles, allowed him not just to survive, but to thrive in a world where most others broke under pressure. He was not merely a lucky adventurer. He was a pragmatist who turned every disadvantage into an advantage, every danger into an opportunity. His path is not a story of heroic deeds, but a textbook on survival and enrichment, written in blood and cynical calculation. This textbook, written in blood and cynical calculation, had many co-authors, not only desperate sailors, but also influential figures whose interests became inextricably linked with his bloody adventures. In Paris, in the corridors of power, where revolutionary governments succeeded one another, Surcouf found not only patrons, but also partners in criminal enterprise. The Directory, and then the rapidly rising Napoleon Bonaparte, understood perfectly. Privateers like Surcouf were not just lucky pirates, but a vital tool in a war of attrition. They overlooked his dubious past, his audacious escapades before obtaining official letters of marque, because he brought gold, millions of francs that fueled the depleted war chest. These officials, these ministers, themselves under the pressure of war, transformed from guardians of the law into tacit accomplices, whose silent approval or active assistance ensured Surcouf's impunity and new opportunities. But the state machinery was not his only accomplice. In Saint-Malo and other port cities where trade flourished, greedy investors awaited him. Large shipowners, moneylenders, merchants, all saw Surcouf not just as a captain, but as a living gold mine. They invested enormous sums in his ships and their outfitting, knowing that every raid, every captured schooner laden with goods, would triple or tenfold their capital. This was not an investment fund in the modern sense, but a carefully concealed network of enrichment built on risk and others' blood. These respectable bourgeois, sitting in their offices, were no less ruthless than Surcouf on deck, for it was their capital that set this predatory machine in motion, and their greed was no less powerful than that of the Corsair himself. This entire system, from the highest echelons of power to the port magnates, existed at the expense of one main antagonist, the British East India Company. This was not merely a trading giant, but an entire empire within an empire, possessing its own armies, fleets, and territories. Its ships, the enormous Indiamen, laden with the treasures of the East, tea, spices, silk, diamonds, were not just a target, but a symbol of British power that France desperately sought to undermine. The history of the East India Company, its fabulous profits, its dominance of global trade routes, was a direct challenge to French ambitions, and Robert Surcouf, with his Confiance, became the spearhead pointed directly at the heart of this financial and military behemoth. His success was a direct blow to its monopoly, its prestige, its coffers. Each captured Indiaman was not only a personal victory for Surcouf, but also a loud declaration that even the most powerful colossus could be wounded if a daring and ruthless enough predator was willing to risk everything for bloody gold. This undeclared war for sea routes and wealth was the true conflict in which Surcouf was not merely a player, but one of the most effective and ruthless instruments in the hands of a state that turned a blind eye to the means to achieve its ends. The capture of the Kent made his name a byword, but Surcouf was not one to rest on his laurels. He continued his raids, each time returning to Saint-Malo with holds packed with trophies, and each time his reputation, and with it his fortune, grew exponentially. He became not just a wealthy man, but a symbol of indomitable will and luck, precisely what war-torn France so desperately needed. His name was whispered in the streets, his adventures recounted in taverns, and each new capture only solidified his status as a national hero. In 1808, when Napoleon Bonaparte's empire reached its zenith, the emperor himself, having heard of the Corsairs' unprecedented successes, made Surcouf an offer that seemed impossible to refuse. Napoleon offered him an official place in the Imperial Navy, the rank of frigate captain, honors, and the prospect of a rapid military career. This was a chance to enter the highest echelons of the French elite, to transition from legalized piracy to noble service to the state, to participate in great naval battles. For most, this would have been the pinnacle of their dreams, proof of true patriotism. But Robert Surcouf, that calculating predator, was not most. He did not seek glory on the battlefield or in the maneuvers of ships of the line. He sought profit, absolute control over his actions, and freedom from any bureaucracy. His answer to Napoleon was polite but firm. He refused. He did not want to be part of a hierarchy, to obey orders, to risk his life for ideals that did not bring him direct financial gain. He preferred to remain master of his own destiny, his own ship, his own money. This refusal became his final, most eloquent statement about his own priorities, definitively dispelling any illusions about his patriotism. It was not a mistake, but a conscious choice, which paradoxically only strengthened his position. The emperor, despite the refusal, could not ignore Surcouf's effectiveness. Instead of punishing him for his audacity, Napoleon, impressed by his business acumen and ability to bring vast revenues to the treasury, took an unprecedented step. In 1809, Robert Surcouf was officially granted a noble title. He became a baron of the empire, a respectable citizen, whose name now shone in official registers. The man whose fortune was built on slave trading and ruthless plunder now sat at the same table with true aristocrats whose ancestors had served the crown for centuries. This was not just recognition, but a public laundering of his blood money, transforming a pirate into a respected landowner. He retired from active sea campaigns, focusing on shipbuilding, investments, and managing his numerous estates. His estates, bought with gold taken from foreign merchants, became a symbol of his new, legal power. He became the largest shipowner in Saint-Malo, effectively a monopolist in several trade operations. His aristocracy was not a legacy of honor or valor, but a direct consequence of his ruthless pragmatism and ability to transform violence into capital. He did not change. Only the name of his activities did. The state, in need of resources, sanctified his crimes, turning them into virtues, and thereby definitively blurred the line between hero and bandit, between law and lawlessness. And in this, perhaps, lay the dirtiest truth about Robert Surcouf and the era that spawned him. At any cost, with any blood, if it brings profit and strengthens power. He was not a hero, but a mirror of his era, reflecting its cynicism and greed. Upon receiving his noble title, Robert Surcouf didn't just change his status, he definitively transformed his bloody spoils into the foundation of a legal empire. The vast capital, accumulated through plunder and slave trading, did not lie idle. It was immediately put into circulation, becoming the driving force for new, seemingly respectable enterprises. Surcouf invested heavily in shipbuilding, evolving from a privateer captain into the largest shipowner in Saint-Malo. Dozens of new ships, now flying the flag of the merchant fleet, slid off the slipways, built with gold taken from British and Dutch merchants. These ships transported goods, but their true origin, their bloody genesis, remained unchanged. Every nail, every plank was paid for by someone's death and someone's ruin. His estates, scattered across France, became another tangible proof of this transformation. Fertile lands, luxurious manors, all acquired with money extracted from the holds of captured Indiamen and from the pockets of robbed passengers. Surcouf, once a hunter of others' property, now became a major landowner, collecting rent and controlling entire regions. He built factories, developed production, creating jobs, and paradoxically, contributing to economic growth that was a direct consequence of his criminal activities. Investors, those very port magnates and Parisian officials who had invested in his privateering raids, received their fabulous dividends. Their capital, multiplied tenfold, strengthened their own positions, creating an entire stratum of newly rich whose prosperity was inextricably linked to Surcouf's successes. This network of mutual benefit, built on risk and legalized violence, became the foundation of a new economic order where the speed of enrichment was valued above morality. For the French state, led by Napoleon, this process was not just convenient, but vital. The money earned by Surcouf flowed into the treasury through taxes, duties on goods, and the stimulation of shipping. His legal activities based on illegal capital helped finance wars, support the economy, and provide employment. The Crown didn't just turn a blind eye to his past. It actively utilized his present, transforming him into an example of a successful citizen who, albeit through questionable methods, benefited the nation. It was a cynical but effective model. The state delegated dirty work to private individuals, then legalized the results, integrating them into the national economy. Thus, Robert Surcouf, baron and shipowner, became the living embodiment of how, in an era of revolutions and wars, money obtained by any means can not only buy a title, but also rewrite history, transforming the most blatant plunder into an economic engine and a national asset. His path from pirate to aristocrat was not redemption, but merely a change of signboard on the same shop that traded in others' blood and gold, now under the protection of the law and with the blessing of the empire. It was this process, which transformed plunder into a state asset, that shaped the myth that still lives on in popular memory. Robert Surcouf entered history not as a slave trader and ruthless predator, but as the king of Corsairs, a brave patriot whose name became synonymous with maritime valor. His statues are erected in ports, streets and ships are named after him, and school textbooks still extol him as one of France's greatest national heroes. But this heroic legend is nothing more than a carefully constructed facade designed to conceal the unsightly truth of how a nation, cornered, was willing to sanction any atrocity as long as it brought profit and strengthened its position. The paradox of his legacy lies in the fact that he became a hero not despite his methods, but precisely because of them. His ruthlessness, his cold calculation, his absolute disregard for human life, all of this, in another situation, would have led him to the gallows. But in an era of chaos and despair, these qualities proved not to be vices, but instruments that the state, on the brink of collapse, not only accepted, but actively encouraged. Surcouf was not an idealist fighting for freedom. He was a pragmatist who understood that in a world ruled by money and power, morality is merely a luxury that not everyone can afford. His patriotism was merely a convenient label, covering a dizzying ascent built on the misfortune of others. He did not serve France. He used France, its needs and its despair, to build his own empire, and the state, in turn, used him, transforming his bloody trophies into a national asset. The universal lesson that the story of Robert Surcouf teaches us resonates disturbingly and remains relevant to this day. It shows how easily society, when faced with an existential threat or simply a thirst for enrichment, is willing to rewrite its moral codes. When survival or colossal profit is at stake, the lines between good and evil blur, and crimes are renamed as heroic deeds. Surcouf is not an exception, but rather the clearest confirmation of how the mechanism of legitimizing violence and plunder works when it benefits the powerful. His story is not about valor, but about the price nations are willing to pay for survival and prosperity, and how easily the dirty origins of vast fortunes are forgotten or distorted. He became a symbol not of nobility, but of a cynical triumph, where success was measured only by the amount of gold, not by the cleanliness of one's hands.